The 10th best wide receiver in the 1970s, Cliff Branch. In an era where it was very difficult for a receiver to accumulate 1,000 yards receiving in a single season, in 1974, Cliff Branch nearly had 1,100. In 1976, he surpassed 1,100 yards. A four-time Pro Bowler, some people say that Cliff Branch had the best season of any wide receiver in all of the 70s. In 1976, he led the league with those 1,100 yards. He had 12 touchdowns, and even though the field's only 100 yards long, he averaged 24.6 yards per reception. He led the league in touchdowns twice and finished the decade with 5,520 yards receiving, 320 receptions, and 50 touchdowns. Number 9, drafted 4th overall in 1972 by the St. Louis Cardinals as Bobby Moore, he later changed his name to Ahmed Rashad. A two-time Pro Bowler, Ahmed had 1,156 yards in 1979, finished the decade with 4,619 yards, 345 receptions, and 32 touchdowns. An interesting thing about Ahmed Rashad, he holds the NFL record for the longest play from scrimmage without scoring a touchdown, 98 yards. Number 8 is Reggie Rucker. Reggie Rucker played in the 1970s for the Cowboys, Giants, Patriots, and Browns. Every one of these top 10 lists that I put together seems to have a Mr. Consistency, and Reggie Rucker is that person for this list, as he never led the league in anything ever. But he did finish the decade 7th in the receiving yards with 5,765, 5th in receptions with 368, and he scored a respectable 39 touchdowns. In 1976, he did finish 2nd in receptions with 60, and he was just the 4th Cleveland Browns receiver to score 3 touchdowns in one game. If you're enjoying this top 10 list, I'd really appreciate it if you could subscribe to my channel. Thank you. Number 8, Mr. Drew Pearson. Drew Pearson signed with the Dallas Cowboys in 1973 as an undrafted free agent and made the team as a special teams player. In 1977, he led the league in receiving yards with 870 yards. You're probably wondering, how does a wide receiver lead the league in receiving yards with only 870? And the answer is because in 1978, the NFL made two very big rule changes. Number 1, they made it legal for offensive linemen to hold the jerseys of defensive linemen, effectively giving quarterbacks more time to throw the football and better able to pass the ball. The other rule they implemented was they made it illegal for defensive players to hit a wide receiver beyond 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. So that's why today's numbers are so much bigger for wide receivers than they were back in the 70s. Anyway, back to Drew Pearson. He was a 3-time Pro Bowler known as Mr. Clutch for his numerous clutch catches in game-winning situations. He finished the decade with 5,713 yards receiving, 335 receptions, and 31 touchdowns. Number 6, Hall of Famer Charlie Joyner, known for his precise route running, was drafted by the Houston Oilers and actually intended to be used as a defensive back. That didn't last very long. Charlie Joyner is a 2-time Pro Bowler, and twice he had over 1,000 yards receiving in the 1970s. His best seasons were actually in the 1980s with the San Diego Chargers, but in the 70s, he was 4th in receiving yards with 6,079, 6th in receptions with 347, and scored 36 touchdowns. Okay, you got to be careful with this one. Number 5, Gene Washington of the San Francisco 49ers, not to be confused with Gene Washington of the Minnesota Vikings, who is also a wide receiver, who also played in the same era, who also went to Pro Bowls. Very confusing. So this Gene Washington played most of his career with the San Francisco 49ers. He led the league in 1970 with 1,100 yards receiving in an era where wide receivers don't get 1,100 yards receiving. He also led the league in 1972 with 12 touchdowns. He was a 3-time Pro Bowler in the 70s. For the decade, he had 6,145 yards receiving, 334 receptions, and was second with 57 touchdowns. Remarkably, for his entire career, he only fumbled the ball twice. Number 4. Ken Burrow played most of his career for the Houston Oilers. In 1975, he led the league with 1,063 yards. That year, he only had 8 touchdowns, but 6 of them were for 50 yards or more. He finished the decade with 6,343 yards, which was second only to Harold Jackson. He was third in receptions with 377, and he scored 42 touchdowns. Number 3, Mr. Stickum himself, Fred Biletnikoff. He led the league in receptions in 1971 and it only took 61 catches. For the decade, he had 393 receptions, which was second only to Harold Jackson, and 50 touchdowns, 5,621 yards. Not blessed with blazing speed, he was one of the best sure-handed catchers of his era. He played in 5 AFC Championship games, was Super Bowl XI MVP, and at the time of his retirement, he held playoff career records for receptions, receiving yards, and touchdowns. Number 2, Harold Carmichael. He played all of the 1970s with the Philadelphia Eagles and was a 3-time Pro Bowler. His best year was 1973 when he led the league with receptions with 67, had 1,116 yards receiving, and a whopping 79 yards per game. Somebody tell me if I'm wrong, but as near as I can tell, Harold Carmichael caught a pass in every single game for the entire decade. He was elected to the Hall of Fame in 2020. For the decade, he had 5,804 yards receiving, made 387 receptions, and scored 55 touchdowns. And number 1, if you're making a list of the greatest wide receivers of the 1970s, there is only one correct answer, and that is Harold Jackson. His best year was 1972 when he led the league in receptions with a mere 62, yards with 1,048. In 1973, he finished second in MVP voting, losing out to O.J. Simpson. In the 70s, he played for the Eagles, Rams, and Patriots, and accumulated 7,742 yards, which was the number 1 total for the decade. He also had 432 receptions, which was number 1 for the decade, and he scored 61 touchdowns, which was number 1 for the decade. On October 14th, 1973, he had his greatest game of his career. He scored 4 touchdowns and had 238 receiving yards. And for reasons that I cannot comprehend, Harold Jackson is not in the Hall of Fame.